In the middle of the arena where there used to be many spirit animals that fought with the challenged warriors, now there was not a single creature left that could stand on its feet, they were either dead or wounded. To the wounded white tiger, who was lying on the ground covered with wounds, came a guy with a blood-covered battle axe in his hands. The tiger roared angrily when he saw the guy and realized what he was about to do, but his face did not change in expression and his hard gaze remained the same. This guy was Ananta, who in his usual hard voice told the tiger that he could hate him. Then swinging his axe at the beast, he added that he should not, however, turn away in the face of death. The axe struck, accompanied by the sound of cutting flesh and blood splattering, which stained the sand of the arena red. One of the warriors watching the scene turned to the large tattooed man standing in front of him and calling him Duke Berngad, he said that everyone was extremely disturbed by the situation. Then pointing his finger at the warriors who were sitting on the ground, he added that it was clear to everyone that that guy was going to win. However, according to their plan, it was the Duke who should be the winner. At the same time, Ananta finished with the tiger, covered in blood, he stood in the middle of the arena with a gloomy look, waiting for the result. After a while, the announcer's voice sounded and announced in a loud voice that the black-haired guy standing in the middle of the arena was the winner. The audience applauded loudly, while the same warrior turned to Duke Berngard, asking what they should do now. The next moment several guards, dressed in masks and white robes, entered the arena, the first of whom solemnly carried a small chest before him. The announcer immediately turned to Ananta in a rapturous voice and said that the guardians of the wings would now bestow upon him a branch of white lotus. At the same time, a man of large build and tattoos replied to his subordinate that there was nothing to worry about as everything was going according to plan. Looking at the guy who was the winner and receiving the award, he added that in any case, the branch of the white lotus flower would still be in their hands. At the same time, Ananta looked at the branch held by one of the guardians without any emotion on his face. As he took the branch, his face became even more intimidating than usual, his eyes filled with hatred and a thirst for revenge. At the same time, at the White Lotus Temple, the floor of which was covered with roots. Sitting behind a barrier of roots, a white-haired boy and girl watched in horror at what was on the other side of the barrier. Nadia was kneeling there, bent over and breathing heavily, holding her wounded side, which was bleeding. In front of her, stood a huge bird-like monster, its eyes glowing red and emitting a terrifying aura. Balzac Ilgini turned to the wounded girl and said in a mocking voice that there was no point in protecting those victims at any cost. Then pointing at the frightened faces of the unfortunate people who should have been victims, he added with a smile that they should be relieved of their fear as soon as possible, and also bestowed with Yo's blessing. "Savior?" the girl asked in a cold voice. After which she said in a cold and angry voice not to make him repeat it twice. In the next moment, a black aura began to form around her again, which began to envelop her body. Saying that he was no savior, she said in a fierce voice that he was just a vile incarnation of a demon, bringing death and horror. Her horns were covered in a black aura, while her eyes shone even brighter at the contrast. Balzac Ilgini looked at the girl with a cold gaze. Then he replied that he would argue with her assertion. With a demonic smile, he stretched his hand forward and held out a finger, saying that true salvation was bestowed through despair. The next moment, tree roots began to emerge from the ground, which frightened the people behind the barrier. However, they didn't have time to realize anything, as the next moment, a root shot out from the ground and instantly pierced through the man's stomach. When Nadia heard the noise, she turned around, but what she saw made her pupils dilate with horror. All those people she had tried to protect by sheltering behind her barrier were now hanging in the air, being set upon by the huge roots. "No, don't," the girl screamed in panic. But it was too late. The next moment, more roots erupted from the ground around the bird-like monster and immediately headed towards it. After that, they stabbed into its skin, causing it to let out a roar. Balzac Ilgini standing in front of the monster and raising his hands to the sky, with a radiant smile on his face solemnly said, "May the blessing of the incarnation of wings illuminate this lost soul." With a mad smile, he added that she would be given a great honor. Immediately after his words, the roots of the white lotus tree on which the bodies were hanging were covered with red light that was pouring out of the corpses. Nadia looked at it with horror and bewilderment, not understanding what was happening, but realizing that it was obviously not good. As it turned out, the red light that had been sucked out of the bodies of the victims, flowing over the roots of the tree, went straight into the body of the monster. As she saw the light form into a horrifying-looking head, she realized what was happening. Balzac-Ilgini confirmed her guesses, laughing madly, saying that it was an infernal field where existence and non-existence coexisted. Unlike the immortal Nava, with a wave of his hand, he added that every man was inevitably doomed to die. The next moment, the barrier behind the girl collapsed. The roots along with the bodies began to fall to the ground. The guy who claimed to be a god continued, saying that he could only give meaning to their miserable existence. The roots that were wrapped around the guard sitting on the ground also began to glow red. Dropping the mask from one of the men, he told the girl to look. It was not a pretty sight, as the man's gnarled face and horrified eyes looked horrible. Balzac-Ilgini continued his ramblings, in a solemn voice that had a hint of madness in it. He said that their meaningless lives would feed the white lotus tree. So they would be able to create an immortal warrior, while they would follow the cycle of life and be reborn by the light that would protect the white lotus tree. The ugly bird-like monster flapped its huge wings, emitting a piercing loud cry. While the incarnation enthusiastically exclaimed that this was the blessing of the wings. Hearing his words, Nadia, with a voice of contempt and anger, asked him what he was talking about, furiously asking how many human lives he had already consumed by adhering to his insane philosophy. He smiled with a wave of his hand. As a result, the roots of the tree burst out of the ground and surrounded the girl, preventing her from moving. Then, folding his arms in front of him, he replied that there were so many of them that he had lost count. Then passing by Nadia, he said that she was still a brave woman, if she continued to resist until the end. Turning his head, he asked her with a wry smile if she had anything to say. She grimaced in pain and anger and replied in a fierce voice, telling him to go to hell. When he heard her answer and grinned, he raised his hand with a smirk and said that it hurt him to see such a miserable end. But he had no time to do the deed, for the next moment the doors opened a little, and a red light came from behind them. Suddenly some black ball flew in. Balzac reacted instantly, attacking the object flying towards him in return. A hole immediately formed in the head of one of the guards, which was that ball. But as it turned out, it was just a decoy, followed by Ananta flying at the surprised Balzac-Ilgini, holding a branch, his eyes filled with rage and glowing red. For some reason he couldn't move, his eyes wide open as he continued to watch the guy fly at him. The next moment, Ananta stabbed a white lotus branch right into Balzac's eye. Then he jumped back and landed some distance away from the guy who was still standing with the lotus branch in his eye. Seeing the main character, Nadia called out to him with hope in her voice. He turned around and was surprised that she was still alive, adding that he didn't know she was so lucky. At the same time, Balzac-Ilgini, standing with a branch in his eye, finally spoke. Turning his head to Ananta, he asked in a horrified voice if he was the winner of the arena. He looked at the entrance, where the dead and bloody bodies of his guards lay, and could not believe his eyes, for he had never thought that someone like him could have gotten here. Ananta was angry at the incarnation's response, angrily asking what he was talking about. The next moment, however, he turned to the root-bound girl and asked her where the wings had gone, and why she was here with that screamer. His words confused the girl, as she couldn't understand what he was talking about. Ignoring her confusion, Ananta added that it wasn't enough to enter Yo's territory without permission. But the next moment his words were interrupted by Balzac, who, exuding murderous intent in a cold voice that made her heart sink, asked how he dared. Then with a face that was twisted with rage, he angrily shouted how he dared to insult the great Yo, the incarnation of wings, with his vile tongue. Then shouting angrily that he would rip it out of the boy's mouth, he applied his transformation, which caused his body to become covered with white feathers, while his hands turned into birds' feet. However, Ananta in a commanding voice, coldly told him to shut up. The next moment, time seemed to slow down. Then he angrily asked everyone in a furious voice, asking if they couldn't see that the person in front of them wasn't the incarnation of wings. At the same time, one of the guards swung his sword at someone. In the next second, he struck a blow. Unfortunately, it hit his helmet, which was knocked aside by the impact. His opponent, not missing the opportunity, quickly counterattacked, cutting the guard in two with his halberd. The man, who was covered in cuts and blood, was none other than Duke Bernhard, who stared steadfastly at the entrance to the White Lotus Temple. Turning to his warriors, he shouted at them to destroy all the guards who would interfere with them. In the next moment a real massacre began, with blood, heads and body parts flying from both sides. Watching it all from the side, Bernhard thought to himself that he was going to strike immediately after the barrier was removed to let the winner through, but to his surprise, the one who was supposed to be carrying the White Lotus branch vanished. Cautiously looking around and holding his huge axe at the ready, he cautiously walked through the open doors, wondering if it could have been a trap. But what he saw inside shocked him. There were some kind of tree roots growing everywhere, with a few people eviscerated on them. The stairs leading upstairs were covered with dead bodies of guards and blood. What he saw made the man think that this was the work of that man, and by the way he was acting, it was obvious that he had not come to the incarnation of wings just to talk. Back inside the temple, there was silence between the three incarnations. The first to break it was Nadia, who looked at Balzac Ilgini and asked Ananta what he meant when he said that he wasn't the incarnation of wings. Looking at the guy who called himself a wing incarnation, who was on the verge of throwing himself at them, she wondered if it was all a hoax. The protagonist irritatedly asked why she had eyes if she couldn't see basic things. Then he asked her if she'd ever wondered why he had such a big name, namely the incarnation of great wings. Nadia's mind immediately flashed back to the snow-white wings she had seen in her dream. Ananta continued, saying that his symbol was 3 pairs of white wings, with an eye in the center. Then pointing to Balzac, he asked the girl if she was the one she had called the incarnation. He added that the whole thing was a clown, since he couldn't even create wings like that. Turning to the guy who called himself an incarnation of wings, he said that if he was imitating him, he should try a little harder. He added that it wouldn't change the fact that he was just useless garbage with a too long tongue. After a moment's silence, Balzac, his eyes widened with rage, replied in a cold voice that he was talking nonsense and that his words made no sense at all. Then, with anger in his voice, he shouted to his guards to kill the boy. They instantly started to carry out the order. The hand of the protagonist began to cover the black aura, blazing with red flames, and as a result, formed into a large clawed paw, which in the next instant struck a blow. Surprisingly, it did not attack the opponents, but cut the roots that held Nadia. The next moment, she and the roots fell to the ground with a thud, emitting a painful groan. Ananta turned his back to the girl and asked her irritably why she was frozen. Nadia turned her gaze back to her shattered barrier. Under the rubble she was surprised to find a white-haired boy and a girl who had somehow managed to survive. Standing in front of a crowd of armed guards, who held their swords at the ready, the protagonist shouted to the girl to get away. Which she did the next moment. One of the guards, with a dried-up face and red eyes, lunged at Ananta with a fierce shout. However, the clawed hand of the protagonist instantly destroyed him. At the same time, the bird-like ugly monster was watching all of this. But he wasn't going to stay away for long. The next moment, it opened its huge mouth, from which many sharp and large spikes appeared, which he immediately released directly into the place where the protagonist fought. Nadia reached the children, covering them with her body, fearfully tilted her head as low to the ground as possible. After a few moments, the dust caused by the monster's attack began to settle. As it turned out, Ananta, who had turned into a lizard and was hanging on the wall like a Spider-Man, managed to successfully dodge the attack. In the next second, with a lightning-fast push off the pillars, he rushed towards the bird-like monster at a tremendous speed. His hatred and rage was displayed in his every movement. At a tremendous speed, he flew into the monster while Balzac watched from the side. The monster managed to block the attack, causing the protagonist to retreat some distance. But even the safe distance was not so safe, because thanks to its huge size, it struck the place where Ananta was with its paw. But thanks to his good instincts, he managed to dodge without any problems. But he didn't just dodge. Concentrating his aura in his right hand, he jumped high into the air. After that, he hit the monster's head with a super powerful punch, causing the spot he hit to vaporize. The decapitated monster staggered backwards, leaning against the wall, while the protagonist jumped backwards. But in the next second, his instincts alerted him to the danger, causing him to look back. He didn't have time to do anything, however, as something came at him, knocking him to the ground. A bird's paw landed on Ananta's chest, pinning him to the ground. It was Balzac Ilgini, who had waited for the right moment to take him by surprise. Turning to the protagonist lying on the ground, he said that he recognized that he was strong enough to even see the true power of the spirits. The next moment, rainbow wings reappeared behind him, with an eye in the center. Extending its claws toward Ananta, it said only one word, Padia. At the same moment, Nadia sensed something and turned around sharply in bewilderment. Seeing that ability for the second time, she realized how he had fended off her attack the first time. But in the next moment, something happened that no one could have expected. A large clawed paw suddenly intercepted Balzac's arm. The next thing he saw was the toothy maw of a humanoid lizard that threatened to devour him. But it was never meant to happen. As Balzac Ilgini managed to intercept the protagonist's head with his second paw. He glared angrily at him, calling him an insolent cretin. But that Ananta was about to be surprised, and immediately raised his free paw. And in the next second he struck the place where the pretender was standing. But he managed to retreat, jumping back to a safe distance. The protagonist, driven by hatred and thirst to kill, grabbed the ground and immediately rushed after him. He attacked furiously, but his opponent managed to dodge all his attacks without much trouble. But Balzac Ilgini wasn't going to run away all the time. At one point he jumped back a greater distance than usual, causing Ananta to immediately rush after him. But that was exactly what the pretender, who had been trapping him all along, wanted, and a gloating grin appeared on his face. The next moment, he threw a punch that the protagonist, flying at full speed, was unable to block. One of the humanoid lizard's paws immediately separated from its body. And with it, he began to fall to the ground. But Ananta was not a man who could be defeated so easily. His eyes lit up with an even brighter red light, and then he let out a furious roar. Suddenly, a new arm instantly began to form in place of his severed arm. Balzac, who had landed on the ground, could not believe what he was seeing. Since his opponent was able to heal such a serious wound in the blink of an eye. Moreover, judging from his attitude, he had no intention of giving up. The next moment, an aura began to gather around the protagonist's outstretched arm, which he launched at his opponent with a wave of his hand. The red streak of the aura cut through the air, heading straight for Balzac. Balzac immediately weaved a few roots in front of him, intending to use them as a shield. But the shield made of roots was not very strong. The streak of red aura cut through the roots without any problems, continued its movement and hit the pretender, cutting him in two. As he felt the pain, he let out a heartbreaking scream, and then he continued to shout curses. Nadia was shocked by what she saw, wondering hopefully if it had worked. But even though half of his body was missing, Balzac was still alive. His previously white eyes were now bloodshot. He struggled to rise, leaning on his arm, moaning painfully, and asked in a furious voice how they had dared to do this to him. Ananta, who realized it wasn't over, stood alert, but the danger came from somewhere he didn't expect it. Behind him, a decapitated bird-like monster rose from the ground. The next thing he knew, he was lunging at the protagonist. Thanks to his instincts, Ananta managed to dodge the attack without any problems. However, when he turned his head, he realized that he was not the main target of that attack. Since they were now facing a real monster that consisted of the body of a bird-like monster while the upper part belonged to Balzac. They were so well matched that they seemed to be made for each other. But in all seriousness, the pretender now exuded a truly terrifying aura. But no matter how fearsome the opponent was, as experience had shown, that never stopped Ananta. A moment later, he disappeared from where he had just stood, leaving only dents in the ground behind him. With an enraged growl, he lunged at Balzac Ilgini while the latter shouted in an angry voice, "I'll show you the difference in strength, and how great the gulf between us is." The sun was shining brightly in the slightly cloudy blue sky. But the next moment, the silence was broken by a thumping sound that sounded like someone hitting glass. At the same time, a small crack appeared in the sky, as if it were something material. But just a moment later, the impact intensified, causing the crack to become even larger. The next moment, the sky, as if it were glass, shattered, its shards flying in all directions. From the resulting hole, a hand clad in a gilded massive glove appeared. In the hole created was a circle that resembled a portal, in which someone's silhouette could be seen. That silhouette turned out to be a majestic man who was dressed in gold and white armor, with a pair of small black horns growing out of his head while a golden semicircle hovered above his head. From a height that allowed him to see everything, he was looking at the city, and more specifically at a white lotus tree, in the center of which something was happening. At the same time in the White Lotus Temple, Balzac Ilgini majestically raised his arms and flapped his wings and said in a solemn voice for all to see his magnificent wings. He wanted to add something else. But Ananta didn't let him do so, as he instantly moved towards him and punched him in the stomach. He instantly bounced back, leaving his opponent writhing in pain. But despite the hole in his stomach, he didn't pay attention to it. Instead he raised his hand, which was glowing with golden light, upwards, gritting his teeth angrily. In the next moment, the roots that appeared from the ground instantly grabbed the protagonist's legs in an attempt to hold him down. At the same time, the hole inside its stomach surrounded by fangs opened even wider. In the next moment, countless white spikes emerged from it. Smirking with a gloating smile, Balzac turned to Ananta and told him that he would cut him to pieces. His words were not idle, as the next moment hundreds of spikes shot at great speed towards where the protagonist was standing. Seeing the approaching danger, he began to gather a red aura in his paws, turning blood red in color. A moment later, the spikes reached their target, creating a tremendous explosion. Seeing this, Nadia shouted the name of the protagonist in panic. But he was not the type to be destroyed by such an attack. And in the next moment, he jumped out of the dust cloud and was behind Balzac. He tried to turn around to repel the attack. But it was too late, as Ananta pushed off the ground with lightning speed. With a fierce roar and fists covered in a blood-red aura, he flew towards him. After catching up with his opponent, the protagonist began to furiously deliver crushing blows that colored everything around him in red tones. However, after delivering a series of blows, he immediately bounced back. Balzac, whose body had once been snow-white and majestic, was now black and ragged. He now looked more like some kind of ugly monster. Gritting his teeth angrily, he cursed the protagonist. However, when he looked at Ananta, who had landed and was standing some distance away, Balzac's red eyes widened in surprise. As he couldn't believe that his opponent's appearance had changed again. The one had become more massive and slightly larger, the claws on his paws had become larger while a red aura emanated from his feet. He wasn't the only one who noticed the change. Nadia, standing nearby watching the fight from the sidelines, was also shocked that Ananta's appearance had changed again. The roots were once again encircling the protagonist's legs, but this was no problem for him, as he just needed to chop off his legs. Once free of the roots, Ananta jumped high into the air. The severed legs immediately began to regrow at an incredible rate, and the next moment it was as if nothing had happened. As Balzac watched, he was increasingly amazed by the abilities of his opponent, who was so powerful that it was beyond human comprehension, and who also possessed incredible regeneration and transformation abilities. Realizing that he couldn't escape from such power, he decided to give his best. If he did, it would crush him faster than he could react. Raising his hand, which was shrouded in a golden aura, he clenched his teeth in an anger. The next moment, the ground began to shake as if an earthquake had started. Nadia cried out and fell back onto her hands, covering the children on the ground with her body. At the same time to Ananta standing on the ground, what was rapidly approaching, it was moving underground, destroying the floor in its path. Upon seeing this, he instantly pushed off the ground and jumped into the air, while the roots rushed after him, intent on catching the enemy. However, their speed was clearly not enough to do so. Despite the number of roots and their rather high speed, the protagonist had no problem dodging them by jumping on the column. Turning his gaze to the one who was controlling the roots, Ananta said to himself that he couldn't go on like this for long. Since no matter how much he attacked, his opponent who had the white lotus branch could also recover. And the more the battle dragged on, the less favorable position he would be in. Suddenly, he shifted his gaze to the center of the temple, where corpses were falling from the top of the white lotus tree. They landed on a slightly smaller tree in the center of the temple before reaching the ground. Ananta immediately thought of a plan that he thought might work. Gathering the aura in his feet. The next instant he pushed himself off the ground with tremendous force. His actions puzzled not only Balzac, who didn't understand what he was going to do, but also Nadia, who opened her mouth in surprise. Ananta, however, continued to fly upwards at breakneck speed, while at the same time gathering an aura in his right hand. As it turned out, his target was the ceiling of the temple, which he struck the next instant. There was a loud explosion, which Balzac Elgini watched with bewilderment as he stood on the ground, not understanding what his opponent was trying to accomplish. A round hole was formed in the ceiling, through which sunlight streamed in. The protagonist, along with the debris of the ceiling, began to fall down. Taking advantage of the fact that he couldn't dodge the attack in the air, Balzac successfully managed to tie up the protagonist with the knees of wood. Moving the immobilized Ananta in front of him, Balzac mockingly asked him if he was going to die under the debris of the ceiling. Or if he was just trying to think up some kind of ruse. There was arrogance and self-confidence in his gaze now, as he thought he could easily win now. "How many?" the protagonist said in a cold voice. "How many lives have you taken?" he asked the fake after a moment. To which the fake, covered in darkness and exuding a horrifying aura, replied that he was tired of counting, adding that he had absorbed so many that he had lost count. Hearing his reply, the protagonist sighed heavily. The atmosphere around him immediately turned purple in color. In the next instant, a pair of wings that glowed with a purple aura grew from his back. After which, Ananta said in a cold and majestic voice that in the name of the innocent lives he had devoured, he would be overthrown by the spirits of the dead. The atmosphere around him instantly changed, filled with the coldness of the dead. The lizard's eyes lit up with a violet light. In the next instant, the ceiling of the temple began to shake, and a noise was heard, as if hundreds of feet were running across the surface. Balzac Elgini was perplexed and looked up, trying to realize what was happening. Fear stirred in his soul, caused by the unknown that awaited him. A few moments later, multiple bodies flew to the ground, their eyes glowing with a purple light. They were zombies controlled by Ananta. Adopting his will, they immediately rushed towards the fake, who continued to stand in bewilderment, not realizing what was happening. Dozens, if not hundreds of zombies rushed towards him, biting and tearing at his body while he frantically flailed his arms, trying to fight off the endless crowd of dead. His furious and frustrated screams could be heard everywhere. Watching this, Nadia again could not understand what was happening and why the dead suddenly came to life and started attacking Balzac. As a result, the zombies, due to their numbers, were able to surround him, starting to tear off chunks of flesh from him mercilessly. His painful and furious screams echoed around the neighborhood. As the dead continued to pile up from above, burying the fake underneath him more and more, he stretched his hand to the sky in despair and let out a heartbreaking cry. Gathering the last of his strength, he next moment burst out of the crowd of zombies that continued to follow him. With desperation in his voice, he rushed to the place where Nadia was sitting with her 2 children and started screaming in a frantic voice that he urgently needed a victim. Seeing Balzac approaching, who looked like a mad monster, Nadia got up from the ground and buried the children with her. Just when all seemed lost, a crack appeared in the sky. From which, in the next instant, a bright column of golden light began to fall directly on the maddened pretender. Having caught up with the monster, it burst with a bright light, from the force of which the girl had to cover her eyes with her hands. Squinting, she tried to see what had happened. In front of her, stood a man with a powerful physique and also clad in golden armor, his foot pressing Balzac's head to the ground. His entire appearance caused awe and admiration. Nadia froze with fear at the mere sight of him. She didn't know how she should react to run or fight when she saw him crouched in front of her. And without raising his head asked if you enjoyed the journey. Nadia was shocked by his words, for they didn't seem to be directed at her, but she was sure there was no one behind her. Nevertheless, there was some movement, and the sad-eyed boy she had so desperately, but not successfully, defended was getting to his feet. She turned around in horror and saw no more of the boy. There was a man with long white hair who was telling that strange warrior who had fallen from the heavens that he had overstayed his welcome a bit. It seems the boy was not what he seemed from the beginning and was spying on everything that was going on around him, but who had the power to do such a thing? The man tore off his clothes, which were clearly too small for him, and exposed his muscular torso. Then the strange warrior claimed that he had come to accompany him. It was now clear that this man was the real incarnation of the wings and he had finally come in person to deal with the fake. Meanwhile, Whitefoot was watching everything that was happening from a safe distance. She was looking up at the tree from above which cracks had formed in the sky. She was reporting the situation to someone from her information guild over the phone. There was a rift in space in the sky above the white lotus tree and it was definitely confirmed information. The ruby lizard was grinding its teeth with anger. Meanwhile, Whitefoot was saying that if Ananta-san was in the temple, he was most likely in a confrontation with his nemesis. It was indeed so. One of the servants or guards of the real incarnation of the wings landed on the floor of the temple. He was equipped in shiny golden armor. Whitefoot continued to report with a gloating and insidious smirk that this all meant that the incarnation of the wings itself was now in the city. In the temple itself, the real incarnation of the wings walked with a confident gait toward the landing place of his protector. He remotely resembled his counterfeit, but he looked completely different. He radiated confidence and inspired awe in everyone who looked at him. He seemed to know everything in the world and nothing could surprise him. When she saw him, Nadia thought her heart would jump out of her chest. It was more like a heart attack. She clutched her chest in terror. Her mind didn't remember, but she thought she knew this man. Watching his back, she thought, what? Who is this man? His silhouette refused to be familiar, but she couldn't remember where she had seen him before. The real incarnation of the wings walked at a leisurely pace toward his pathetic counterfeit, who was wedged between the stones and could only moan muffledly now. Balzac Ilgini's eyes widened in horror when he saw who approached him. The incarnation of wings looked at him with contemptuous arrogance and asked what he was doing here. Balzac raised his bloody head and asked him how he could forget him so quickly. Especially after tearing the wings off his loyal servant. He reminded him that he had been a cruel master to him in the past. The incarnation of the wings nonchalantly answered him that he had taken them away precisely because he deserved that punishment, all because he had allowed his desire for false glory to twist his mind. Then at his command his protector lifted the rest of Balzac's body, holding it by the neck. The man clenched his teeth together and groaned. As it turned out, there wasn't much left of him, but he was still alive. The incarnation of wings reminded him that wings were a divine gift sent down to those who had originally been created to soar high in the clear sky. Balzac still didn't understand what he meant and grinned his toothy grin and asked what the hell was this nonsense. How dare he say that to him, the one who revered him more than anyone else and was his most loyal servant. The one who had sacrificed thousands, even tens of thousands of lives to create this perfect body. Someone who wanted his wings back at any cost. Balzac was desperate and furious. To this incarnation of wings replied to him that he was stupid and didn't understand anything. Then he put his hand on the rest of his body. And then he also added that he felt sorry for him. In the next instant, the rest of Balzac's body lit up with a bright yellow glow. It crumbled into yellow dust, leaving behind nothing but a small branch of a white lotus tree. Meanwhile, under the pile of corpses of the former victims of the wings incarnation, something was wrong. The eye that belonged to Ananta was watching the action from there, covered by all those corpses. And it all reminded him of something from the distant past. He remembered standing on the edge of a cliff at sunset with his teacher, who had told him he had a dream. A dream to find the edge of the earth where their world joined the world of the gods. The teacher convinced him that he would not stop until he reached his goal. Little Ananta had no idea how it would all turn out for him in the end. As it turned out, that teacher was the incarnation of Wings, and he was still young then, but even then he was as confident and determined as ever. He said that even if the world turned against him, he would sacrifice him to achieve his goal. Little Ananta looked up to his teacher with admiration, for he was an example and a hero to him. Then something happened that he could not even imagine. His home village was burned to the ground and smoke billowed above it. All the villagers died in the fire except him. Even his favorite sister, who had always been kind to him and always wished him only the best. She too perished in those flames. These painful memories made his eyes flash with rage. The Wings Incarnation's protector stated that the White Lotus tree had a strange name and seemed to be nothing more. It seems his dream had failed again. Wings Incarnate agreed with him. He held a branch of the White Lotus tree in his hand and said that it was a symbiosis of the power of the branches and the divine tree, and it was only a pitiful semblance, not even worthy of comparison with the world tree. Even so, he found something interesting and he turned his attention to Nadia. She was still holding on to her heart and could not get up. He walked closer to her and behind his back appeared the same two pairs of white shining wings. That's what the real appearance of the incarnation of Wings was like. But then suddenly there came a voice that told him that he had forgotten about a very curious connection. With those words, the clawed paw of a black lizard emerged from the pile of corpses. And then Ananta emerged in all his glory and fury, ready for battle with eyes blazing with hatred. He spread the full power of his claws to prepare his attack. He swung his claws and red arrows of energy flew towards his enemy. He didn't even seem to pay attention to the attack and didn't even turn towards it. However, the attack did not reach its target, but was blocked by an insurmountable obstacle in the form of the Wings Incarnate's protector, who blocked the attack with his hand. Such a powerful attack left only a few scratches on his armor. Wings Incarnation smugly smiled and began to turn around to his enemy and said that at last he had finally found him. Ananta roared in rage, ready at any moment to lash out at his enemy that he had hated for so long. He had waited for this opportunity for far too long and could take no more. With a growl he rushed to the attack, moving on 4 limbs at once. Only one defender separated him from this long-awaited revenge, and he was not going to stop in front of him. Ananta wanted to take him down with a single blow. Well, as soon as he got close to him he received a powerful blow to his toothy head. The blow was so powerful that it just blew off his entire head with a large part of the top of his torso. His head immediately began to regenerate back, burning with a red aura. The defender told him to tell him his name. But Ananta, whose head had already regenerated almost completely, only roared furiously in response. The defender was embarrassed by this response, but he did not hesitate and clenched his fist to gather energy for the next blow. He got into a fighting stance and said that talking didn't seem to help. Ananta roared again and rushed into the fight with fury. But this time he was ready for resistance, and dodged the defender's blow, then brought his fist down hard on his face. The incarnation of Wings, meanwhile, paid absolutely no attention to the fight that was going on behind his back. For some reason he was interested only in Nadia, who was looking at him with tension and could not move. He came closer and reached out his hand to touch her head. But he didn't succeed, for the next moment a bloody axe began to cleave the air. It didn't hit its target, but it nevertheless forced the incarnation of Wings to move away from Nadia. It was Lord Bernhard, the leader of the warriors, who delivered the blow. He was very surprised that the enemy was able to dodge such a sudden blow. Moreover, the incarnation of Wings had somehow managed to get behind him. He asked Bernhard that he would probably never give up, would he? He only answered him with a tense look of hatred. Lord Bernhard was an experienced warrior, but he didn't stand a chance against the incarnation of Wings. Nevertheless, he was not going to give up just like that and turned around to face his enemy. Behind him, Ananta and the Wings Incarnate's defender fought a desperate battle, each taking blow after blow, but their strength seemed to be equal. Their fight didn't stop for a second, each of them confident in their strength and ready to fight to the end. Watching what was happening behind the defender's back, Ananta warned him that he would tear him to pieces, as well as anyone who got in his way. And then he added that he would tear and kill them all. With each word, his scales grew red hotter and hotter, and his body seemed to grow larger with his rage. But the defender disagreed with him and with one powerful blow with a shout of "Sparta" sent him flying. But even such a powerful blow that destroyed most of the lizard's body didn't stop him. Moreover, it seemed that with each blow he received he stopped only more and his body was burning more and more bright red color, scales became tougher and bigger. Giant dark wings began to grow from his back. He let out another fierce roar, attracting the attention of everyone in the temple. Immediately everyone turned around and looked at what had once been Ananta in horror. Now in front of them was a giant black dragon that was blazing with its red fury. Only the incarnation of the wings seemed to be not at all surprised by this transformation. And said with a smile that he finally saw a familiar face. Moreover, he knew this dragon very well, he even knew its name, it was called the Black Dragon Azhi-Dahaka. It was the incarnation of vengeance, anger and rage. But everything had to be paid for and for this transformation Ananta paid with his sanity. He found himself in some desolate place high up in the mountain somewhere in the back of his mind. He looked around but he still didn't realize where he was. He had many questions he wanted to ask, but there was no one here to answer them. He didn't know what this place was or how he got here. Even the sky here was red and burning with fire. Ananta thought this was bad and he should get out of here as soon as possible. He looked up and wondered where would he go next. But then a voice came from behind him and told him to remember. It was a huge black dragon standing in the middle of a lake of flames, telling him to remember who he was taking revenge on, who had taken everything from him and who he despised. Ananta recognized who it was and was horrified. It was the dragon Azhi-Dahaka himself. The dragon looked at him intently and told him that he was a cursed mortal. Then he brought his head even closer to our protagonist and told him that he was wallowing in regrets and was consumed by his blind rage. While Ananta was imprisoned on the edge of his consciousness, his body went into a berserk rage and began to crumble everything in front of him. And first in his path was the Wings Incarnation's protector, who barely had time to dodge his fierce blows that scattered rocks like dust. The defender realized that he could not resist the hail of such blows, so he retreated further away to take a short respite. He looked at the mad dragon and realized that he had lost his mind and had fallen into a berserk state. And now it seemed that nothing could stop him. The protector began to gather energy in his fist again, preparing a powerful attack. He said that someone who goes into a blind rage is a pitiful sight. His fists were burning with fire and he had a golden aura around him. In his dragon form, he had one special attack which was a deadly fire breath. And he used it without delay to crush his annoying enemy. Well, he was not wasting energy in his fist, he hoped to use his attack to repel the dragon's next attack. And when the dragon released a powerful stream of fire at him, he retaliated with a series of lightning-fast strikes to stop the flames. From the collision of their attacks, the flames spread throughout the temple. Wings Incarnate even had to cover himself with a wing to avoid being caught in the flames. Incarnate Wings turned to his opponent Lord Bernhard. He told him that he could have become a handful of ash in the blink of an eye, but he didn't budge, and because of that he respects him even though he is his enemy. Lord Bernhard indeed stood still and bravely withstood the torrents of flame without moving. He saw his chance in the enemy's delay and decided that now was the time to attack, and if he waited for his comrades he would miss it. So he rushed at his enemy without delay and shouted that he would fight to his last breath. He swung his axe and with a fierce cry was about to bring it down upon his enemy. But then his chest was cut by a thin beam of light. The incarnation of Wings moved forward with lightning speed, and a cut was formed on the warrior's chest, from which blood immediately gushed out. Immediately afterward, his axe and sling fell to the floor with a clatter. The incarnation of Wings said without emotion that this was the end for him. Well, as it turned out, the warrior was not so simple and with a growl started to turn into a beast, quickly healing his bloody wound. But just as he began to transform, the incarnation of Wings pierced him with another beam of light. Even for the beast, it was enough and he fell helplessly to the ground. The Wings incarnation only needed to point 2 fingers in its direction to do so. After dealing with the annoying foe, he walked over to Nadia and told her that she was shaking with fear. She still couldn't move and could only stare back at him hatefully. When he walked up to her, his 3 pairs of wings appeared behind his back. He told her that she wasn't what she used to be. Nadia finally remembered where she had seen him before. She had seen him the very day she lost consciousness and was captured by another animal essence. That very day she thought she had been sitting in the middle of a sea of blood and a white angel with 3 pairs of wings had appeared to her. But after that encounter, she remembered nothing. Meanwhile, the incarnation of the wings said that the vibration of the branches proved that she too was a vessel chosen by the universal tree. Nadia did not understand what he was talking about and asked what branches, what was he talking about. But as it turned out, Nadia was not interested in him yet, and he went on to the corpse of the giant bird that used to sit in a cage and which was controlled by Balzac. Going to it, he explained that the branches are miracles beyond the limits of the human body and giving great power. In his hand he held the same shining branch that was left after Balzac's disappearance. He was going to insert it into the corpse of the beast. And as he put the branch into the wound, he said that his main desire was to reach the end of the earth, the same words he had spoken to Ananta many years before. Immediately afterward, the massive carcass of the ancient bird-like beast glowed with yellow lightning. Streams of bright yellow lightning filled the entire temple, and at their epicenter the giant carcass disappeared. In its place appeared a child that was still engulfed in small yellow lightning bolts. The incarnation of wings immediately turned to him and told him that he was his brother, created by thousands of human lives and once caged. Then he asked him to tell him his name. Nadia watched all this with horror and amazement. She had never seen anything like this before. This boy had a manic smile and red eyes with pupils like a snake. He introduced himself that his name was Ziz. But all this action had no effect on the battle between Ananta and the Wings Incarnation's protector. Their fight was in full swing. They exchanged blow after blow and neither of them wanted to concede. But in dragon form, the advantage was clearly on Ananta's side. And now even the powerful reinforced punches of the defender. He blocked them with no problem. And he was forced to retreat. But suddenly, instead of chasing him, the dragon let out a loud roar and prepared something else. The defender looked at him with incomprehension. Something was wrong here. As it turned out, the dragon was preparing to take off. He began to flap his huge red wings in preparation for a dash. And in the next instant, it soared through a hole in the ceiling. It flew high above the temple and hovered just above it. As the dust from the dragon's flight began to dissipate, Ziz was a little scared and looked at the dragon with anger, preparing to attack. The incarnation of wings calmed him down and placing his hand on his head, he told him not to be afraid. But it seemed that fear was worth it, for the dragon began to form a giant ball of flame high in the sky. When it reached its maximum size, the dragon unleashed it directly at his enemies. This ball of flame was called the Jade Heaven Fire. The ball rushed towards the ruins of the temple with speed. It was so huge and flew so fast that it resembled a meteorite. The incarnation of wings was not afraid of it at all. He raised his hand and asked how dare he look down on them. And adding that he had no place in the heavens, he began to gather streams of blue light in his hand. At the moment when the ball of flame was about to hit them, the incarnation of the wings said, "Let there be light," and a bright flash of light illuminated the entire temple. This stream of light not only destroyed the flame ball, but flew straight into the dragon. After the beam of light hit the dragon, there was a very powerful and bright explosion that illuminated the entire top of the white lotus tree and the entire city around. It seemed that there was no trace of the dragon, only circles of black smoke. Whitefoot and Ruby watched the whole thing. The bunny girl tried to hold the lizard with all her might and told her superiors on the phone that it was all over. She reported in a sad voice that soon after the battle at the top of the white lotus tree, the tree itself had been destroyed by the forces of the wing incarnation. This was indeed true, and the top of the tree was engulfed in flames. Whitefoot continued his report and said that their trump card Vengeance Incarnate had been defeated. Ananta was now unconsciously falling from the sky, engulfed in smoke and remnants of the flames. But despite the rabbit girl's assumptions, Ananta still seemed to be alive, unconscious and hurtling toward the ground. Let's go back in time and discover the beginning of Ananta's story. As a young boy, Ananta grew up in a desolate area under the scorching sun, where not much grew and food was hard to find. Among the rocky terrain, only a few small areas of grass could be seen. Therefore, any movement in the desert attracted attention, especially when a pack of 4 hyena-like dogs chased after a small red lizard. The lizard ran with all its might, but there was no chance of escape as the dogs were catching up to it quite quickly. The first 2 of them sped up and were ready to attack. They had already opened their mouths to grab the poor lizard and end its torment. But suddenly a flying axe whizzed through the air. It hit one of the dogs in the forehead and it howled pitifully. Blood splattered in all directions. A foot immediately ran past the surprised lizard, whose owner shouted at the dogs to get away. It was Ananta, who was holding his other axe and was about to finish the dog off. The blood spurted again. And the dog fell dead under the gaze of his slumped pack. Ananta furiously let out the battle cry of his tribe. After which the other dogs fearfully began to whimper and run away. Ananta smugly looked after the fleeing hyena-like dogs, while the lizard looked at his savior with admiration. Ananta then tied up the dead dog and dragged it to the shade under a large rock, where he sat down hiding from the heat and wondering what he should do next. He propped his chin up with his hand while the lizard stayed near him and wagged its tail like a tame dog that wasn't going anywhere. The lizard's movements were starting to get on his nerves and he grudgingly asked why she was following him. And then she added that she was useless to him because she didn't even have meat, only bones. He started waving his hand trying to drive it away and asked why it didn't just want to get away. The lizard resentfully bounced a little farther away. And deep in her throat a fire began to ignite. And then it let out a stream of flame that nearly fried Ananta, who looked on in amazement at the whole thing and barely managed to dodge. Now he didn't think the lizard was so useless and asked how did she have flame breath. Is she really a descendant of dragons? The lizard turned away from him with a smug look showing her contempt for his stupidity. But then suddenly there was some movement behind Ananta's back, which alerted him. He turned around sharply to look at it, pouring sweat from worry. Something gigantic had come up behind him, right from where there was a rock behind which he was hiding from the sun. It turned out that it wasn't a rock at all, but a giant rhinoceros that had been resting there and the lizard had woken him up with its flames. And now he woke up and was furious that these miserable little bugs had disturbed his sleep. His eyes that burned with anger focused on poor Ananta, who realized that now he had to get away quickly or he would be left with nothing but a flatbread. Ananta quickly grabbed the lizard and put it on his head and immediately started running with all his might, trying to escape the furious rhinoceros that was chasing him. He ran as fast as he could, not caring what road he was on as he approached the cliff, hoping that the rhinoceros would not want to chase him for so long and jump off the cliff. He barely made it to the edge and jumped off with a desperate cry. He landed on 2 feet at once and thought he was saved, but as it turned out there was someone else watching him, a man in a cloak. Ananta was surprised to see him, and asked himself why there was a man in the middle of the desert. But he had no time to find out, for the rhinoceros was not going anywhere, and furiously exhaling air from its nostrils was also preparing to jump. Ananta looked at him irritably and asked, "So you're not going to lag behind, are you?" Well, if that was the case, he was not going to run any further either. He set the lizard on the ground and it squeaked fearfully. Ananta got into a fighting stance and took out his axe, then he said to the rhino, "Go ahead and attack. I will show you the power of the air of the great black dragon," he said with confidence in his eyes. But suddenly this strange hooded man approached him, Ananta not knowing his intention turned towards him in terror. But the stranger did not do anything horrible, just took the hood off his head, putting his white hair under the rays of the bright sun and looked confidently at the rhinoceros. The rhinoceros stared at him too, not about to back down. But when the stranger's eyes shone with a blue light, the rhinoceros immediately turned around and started running away in a hurried and frightened manner. Ananta then looked at the stranger curiously. It was the first time he had seen someone who could scare a stone rhinoceros with his mere appearance. The stranger looked at him with a smile and asked, "Boy, are you all right?" Ananta later recalled that that day, after meeting this stranger, his life changed. It changed forever. After that he brought his new teacher, as he introduced himself to him, to the village of their tribe, which was situated on the bank of a river so valuable in those parts. Their tribe was nomadic and periodically moved from place to place, getting food by gathering, hunting and fishing. The tribesmen greeted Ananta with joy, but were wary of his companion. One of them asked Ananta if he was still wandering around. Then they asked who was it that was walking beside them. Ananta replied that it was all right and it was an acquaintance of his who had helped him a lot. But immediately another voice was heard shouting his name, and the sound of which frightened Ananta very much. It was his sister, who was now running towards him and asking him where he had been missing for so long. Running up to him, she grabbed his cheeks and told him not to tell her that he was going to the spirit world alone again. If something happened to him, what would she do without him? Then she noticed the strange lizard on his head and asked him where the strange animal had come from and why he had brought it with him. Ananta simply replied that the lizard had followed him and that was all, he couldn't get rid of it. It was only then that she noticed the stranger who had come with her brother and asked who he was. Ananta introduced her to her teacher. He called him master and introduced his sister Ashita to him. His sister suddenly coughed and cold sweat covered her face. She coughed out black blood on her hand. Ananta immediately ran up to his sister and asked if she was all right. She told him not to worry and rather go with her to the house. But her look was not good. The stranger noticed all this and was quickly coming up with a plan how he could use this gullible boy. When Ananta and her sister left, the stranger was invited to the chief of the tribe to meet him and learn from him the purpose of his visit to the tribal lands. There he was immediately offered refreshments and invited to make himself comfortable. The tribal chief was pleased with the guest, for they do not often receive foreigners, so he told him that it would be disrespectful not to treat a guest who had helped a member of their tribe. He also told him that he could rest as long as he needed to continue his journey. The stranger introduced himself as Master Ryu and was grateful for their tribe's hospitality. As we see in the past incarnation of Wings was not embarrassed to call himself by other names and deceive gullible people. Wings incarnate looked at the lizard incredulously. She didn't have much sympathy for him either, as if knowing his true intentions. The Wings incarnate's eyes glowed bright blue again and the lizard hid frightened behind Ananta, who had already helped his sister and had come to listen to the conversation. The elder said that Ananta would show the guest around the neighborhood, which he was not at all happy about and asked why him. The warrior who was sitting near him put his hand on his head and advised him not to argue with the elder. But before letting the guest go, the chief had a few more questions for him. He wondered what had brought Master Ryu to such wild places where everywhere the land was broken and unfit for travel. The incarnation of Wings confidently replied that he was an explorer and was studying customs, locations, and incarnations from various regions. The chieftain did not fully understand what he was saying and asked again what kind of incarnations. The guest pulled a scroll out of his bag and offered him a look. Then he unfolded the map and explained that from the empire in the east to the glaciers in the far north through the deep forests of the west, he had traveled for many years collecting legends and traditions. He was particularly interested and fascinated by the tale of a deity that had been passed on in this wilderness by word of mouth for centuries. Ananta listened to his teacher fascinated, though he did not understand what he was talking about. But the elder and the older tribesmen suspected what he was talking about and asked him to specify which deity he was talking about. Incarnate Wings answered them and gave them a name that put them in awe, Azidahaka. He explained that this ancient black dragon had received the power of the gods and he was one of the 6 incarnations. He was called the greatest and strongest of all incarnations. He was treated with reverence and fear by all, and with terror behind his back. He was called the demonic incarnation, the black dragon Azidahaka. And at that moment, he was sleeping peacefully in one of the caves among the rocks near this village.